not feedbacky enough?
It's good. Good.
Okay, good. Welcome, my name is Rachel Crocker, and I am the director here at the Albany County Public Library. We are so excited to have you all here this evening. I'm excited always to partner with the League of Women Voters. It is always a wonderful partnership to bring the community together to talk about a range of issues. I'm super excited about tonight. I think it's going to be fascinating. So I am just going to say welcome, thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Nancy from League of Women Voters. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. And we're really pleased also to be co-sponsoring with the Albany County Public Library for this, and I think they're on board to be co-sponsoring this as a little, heads up for the upcoming elections that will be upon us before we know it, in case you haven't already noticed in terms of the media coverage going on. But we will be having forums come this summer for the primary and again in the fall, and we'll partner with the library. So, good evening and a warm welcome to everyone. I know this is a busy weekend. There were lots and lots of activities going on, so we're pleased that this became a priority for your weekend to be at our event. I'm Nancy Lockwood, co-president of the League of Women Voters with Lynn Akina, who is also here. She can raise her hand. The Laramie League, along with the Albany Public Library, is excited to be presenting tonight's educational program, 100 Years of Empowering Voters, Considering Alternative Voting Methods to Enhance Democracy. We bring you this program not only during the 150-year anniversary of women's suffrage in Wyoming, but on the 100-year anniversary of well-known suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt's visit to Laramie, Wyoming. Carrie Chapman Catt founded the National League of Women Voters on February 14, 1920. She visited Laramie, Wyoming on November 9, during the dates of November 9 through 11, to attend a women's conference and to assist in the establishment of a Wyoming League of Women Voters. So we begin tonight's program with a short recognition of Carrie Chapman Catt and her contributions to women's suffrage.
I'm Robin Hill, and I happen to have some selections from newspapers of exactly 100 years ago this weekend. I could. Okay. So for example, the Cheyenne State Leader, a few days before now, has said that reservations for 200 guests are being made for the banquet to be held in Laramie on the evening of November 11th as the closing event of a two-day conference of the League of Women Voters. And the excitement builds to November 10th, 1919, Party of 5 with Carrie Chapman Catt lead league sessions. So this is not really about Carrie Chapman Catt. You can do your own research on her. She was important. But about her visit to Laramie on this date, almost exactly this date. Now, later on, the entire program for the Women's Conference is published in the Boomerang. And it starts with a song. They have lots of songs interspersed with their talks. And in fact, all meetings of this conference are held in the Carnegie Library. What could be more appropriate? 100 years ago, right down the street, and here we are. So the call to order was given by Mrs. Melville C. Brown, State Chairman. Mrs. Emma Howell Knight addressed the group. There were several talks. There were many talks here over 2 days. Mrs. Stephen W. Downey talked about suffrage and the home. There were talks on the woman voter and the nation's laws, the woman voter and the nation's food, the woman voter and the nation's morals, and more songs. And then Carrie Chapman Catt gave an address called Wake Up America. Now, in preparation for our conference, we have an address of welcome from the Honorable Edward Ivinson.
It gives me pleasure, unusual pleasure, to greet you, and in my capacity as mayor of Laramie, to bid you welcome to our city and to wish you success in the noble and self-sacrificing work you have undertaken for, for the enfranchisement, freedom, and enlightenment of women. You are engaged in a glorious work, and in wishing you success in your laudable undertaking, I feel sure I am expressing not my own sentiments, but the sentiments of the citizens of this, the gem city of the Rockies. As proof of the tenacity towards the emancipation of women, and as showing that the labors of the faithful few were beginning to bear fruit, we point with pride to the memorable fact that this state, the state of Wyoming, is at its first legislative assembly passed a bill granting equal rights to women. This bill was signed by Governor Campbell on the 10th day of December, 1869. So in conclusion, allow me once again to wish you success beyond your most sanguine expectations, and to express the hope that you may receive unlimited support and encouragement in the noble and glorious work in which you are engaged. Permit me also to assure you that you are truly welcome to our city and that we feel honored by your presence here. I thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Ivinson.
And now we'll come forward in time by 100 years. 100 years later, the League continues Carrie Chapman Catt's work towards the empowerment of voters and in defense of democracy. To these ends, Matthew Link will tell us about the voting process and how this reflects the collective will of the electorate. Matthew Link is a member of the League of Women Voters of Laramie. He has a BS degree in biology with a minor in math and is now a graduate student in the biological science at the University of Wyoming. He also has an intense interest in the political process and how voting impacts this process. In the time between his college graduation and beginning graduate school, Matthew embarked on a period of self-reflection and self-education regarding the political process and ultimately voting methods. He views himself as a scientist first and foremost, who believes very strongly in evidence-supported arguments. He brings his education and training in the sciences of math, his computer skills, and his knowledge of statistical analysis tools to a study of voting methods. Matthew is most knowledgeable about this topic as, in his own words, and I quote you, Matthew, that's all right, I've done a frightening amount of self-directed research on it. Several books, lots of videos, and easily over 100 articles. Turns out voting methods are one of the single most critical issues in electoral politics. Welcome, Matthew.
Okay. Get the lights. All right. I'm going to talk to you tonight all about voting methods, why they matter. Did you know they matter? You should by the end. So this talk is called Voting Methods and Social Choice. How can we enhance democracy with alternative voting methods? So I want to start with the basics, really simple stuff. What is democracy? Well, a literal dictionary definition comes from the ancient Greek word demokratia, rule by the people. It's a little vague, doesn't help us that much. I want to start this talk by working with a general principle. Democracy is when decisions are made that affect you, you should be a part of those decisions. Now, we've made a lot of progress in democracy since Carrie Chapman Catt first came to visit us in the 100 years since then, but there may still be more to do. So I'm going to start on a provocative note. I have in my hands here a landmark political science paper that was released in 2014 by a team of Princeton researchers. And I'm just going to go through their data real quick. They analyzed 1,779 oppose or support policies questions spanning 20 years of public opinion polls. And with these polls, they were able to separate respondents into a 50th percentile of income earners and a 90th percentile of income earners. thus to establish the preferences of the average, median, middle-class American, and the 90th percentile, the affluent American. And finally, to this data set, they added, they wanted to find out what were the powerful interest groups in society, groups which regularly appear in the Forbes Power 25 lists, along with 10 key industries that regularly report the highest lobbyist expenditures. And then with a, quote, small army of undergraduates, they were able to establish from this list net interest group alignment, which is basically the total number of groups supporting a policy minus the total number of groups opposing that policy. So they had 3 variables, and they wanted to use them to build a predictive model to answer the question, was proposed policy change within each survey question actually implemented within 4 years after the question was asked? So let me give you a graphical depiction here. So we have the preferences of average citizens, the preferences of economic elites, and the preferences of interest groups. And we want to predict if public policy was implemented in line with these preferences. So to cut the story short, they had some rather provocative conclusions. One of them is, quote, when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Furthermore, perhaps you think that, okay, but what if the interest groups generally align with what our average American wants? Well, they answered that too. Turns out interest group alignments are almost totally unrelated to the preferences of average citizens. So we have a lot of public citizen interest groups, like Public Citizen, Citizens Climate Lobby, like the Sierra Club, all sorts of those interest groups. But it turns out overall, the sum interest group opinion from the most powerful interest groups does not align with the preferences of average citizens. So there's a word for this. The word is oligarchy, rule by the few, or perhaps plutocracy, rule by money, because it's not just the affluent citizens whose opinions can predict public policy, it's the special interest groups of whose money they fund, or whom they fund with their money. Okay, so democracy's not looking too great lately. The question is, why? Why isn't democracy functioning very well in America? So the obvious answer that people come up with is, it's money. It's all about money. Money in politics. We have to get money out of politics. To be sure, we've had several Supreme Court decisions since 2010, including Citizens United v. FEC and McCutcheon v. FEC, that basically blew open the floodgates to dark, unaccountable money in politics, unaccountable campaign financing. And they basically blew up, They basically blew up a whole bunch of state laws around campaign finance, including stuff in the Wyoming Constitution. So money in politics maybe plays a role. To be sure, money spent in congressional races since then has explosively increased with every election since. And the vast majority of congressional races are won by the top spending candidates. In fact, the numbers are 75 to 95% of House or Senate races in the last 10 years were won by the candidate who spent the most money. So there seems to be a role here. But there's a detail in this paper, if you ever see it cited online in your independent news outlets, that they leave out. And the detail is that the public opinion surveys they used to make this study were from 1982 to 2001. That's about 10 years before the Citizens United and McCutcheon Supreme Court cases. So it seems that democracy hasn't been functioning very well for quite a long time. Okay, well, now I'm going to focus on a different possible explanation. Oh, come on. Hold up. So a different possible explanation. Political parties. or the lack thereof of them. So in case you haven't noticed, the United States is an immensely two-party dominated country. Every presidential election after 1824 has been won by a member of one of the two major political parties. So well over 150 years. Actually, we're approaching 200. And just as an example of this dominance, in the 2004 presidential election, the top two parties' candidates got 50.7% of the vote and 48.3%, while no other candidate got more than 0.38%, and all of the other candidates combined got less than 1%. So massive two-party domination in elections. But why? Why is this? Can it really be that such few Americans support or identify with other parties, other candidates? Can it really be that America is united in the belief that the Republicans and Democrats represent the absolute summit of political thought, with no other combination of views possibly being superior? Probably not. So this is a series of Gallup polls started since 1988 on political party identification. And we see that for most of the time, since 1992, I think, more people have identified as independents than have identified as either Democrats or Republicans. Let's go on.
What happened in 2004?
What happened in 2004 is Ralph Nader ran for president in the year 2000, and the media went on a blitzkrieg to discourage people from voting for third-party candidates. That's basically the explanation. Even like staunch progressives, like whatever his name is, the Fahrenheit 9/11 guy, even he sold out Ralph Nader.
Roger Moore.
Yeah, Michael Moore. Roger Moore is his first argument. Anyway. So, all right, but that doesn't necessarily mean people want third parties, or does it? Well, Gallup has you covered there too. Since the year 2006, they've demonstrated that more people, now let me just read it off. The question they asked people was, do the Republican and Democratic parties do an adequate job of representing the American people? Or do they do such a poor job that a major third party is needed? Well, since 2006, more people have agreed that a third party is needed than have agreed that the two parties do an adequate job for what that means. Okay, so it's clear there's some kind of demand for third parties in America, and yet we don't really have them, or the ones that we have are so effectively marginalized no one knows about them. You might be shocked to learn that 8 different people were on the Florida presidential ballot in the year 2000. More than just Al Gore, George Bush, and Ralph Nader. 8 different parties. So there is a desire for third parties. Why can't we get them? Well, that turns us to this concept called Duverger's laws. Duverger's law. It's a French name, and I'm terrible at those R's. So this guy by the name of Maurice Duverger, in the 50s and 60s, observed a trend in political party dominance among a number of modern democracies. He looked at their histories and saw what was what. And subsequent research in the political sciences since then has prompted these scientists to refer to the trend as a general law of political science. So Duverger's law goes like this. Any political body with 2 key features. Number 1, plurality rule elections. So the way we vote in America is you get 1 vote, and you put that 1 vote on 1 candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. That's plurality voting. So anybody with that feature, and number 2, single winner election districts. So in America, we have this big jigsaw of election districts. We're always worried about gerrymandering, right? Each district gets 1 person to represent it, a single winner. So Duverger's law states that any political body with both of these features combined has a strong tendency to favor a 2-party political system. And this is due to feedback loops between elections. So one party does well, and then they just keep doing better and better. Or rather, one third party does badly, and then they just keep getting more marginalized due to tactical voting.
So what can we do about Duverger's law? Well, the obvious solution is proportional representation, something that wide swaths of the developed world have figured out a long time ago. So if we were to take the city council boards in Laramie, for instance, the way proportional representation would work is we would fuse all these wards together into one big election district, and then we would have multiple winners on a single ballot based on the proportion of votes gotten. So I think it's usually like maybe one person from each district runs each election. Well, we would just have one election and 3 winners. Okay, and here is kind of the status of proportional representation globally. Does anybody notice a pattern going on here?
Yeah.
Interesting pattern, maybe? What do you think it is?
English speaking.
Yeah. Most of the countries that were former British colonies and French colonies still use single-member districts. But the rest of the world has figured out proportional representation. Just as an example of what proportional representation can do is in the German Bundestag, they generally have like 9 to 11 different parties with representatives elected at any given time. That's proportional representation. Now, we actually do have proportional representation in certain parts of America. It's found in a big smattering of municipalities around the country. Recently, proportional representation was adopted in East Point, Michigan, and in Mission Viejo, California. But there's an obstacle to getting proportional representation, a serious obstacle in the US. It's a very difficult reform to get at higher offices, including national and state legislatures, because of the way that our national constitution and many state constitutions describe the composition of legislative bodies. So what's the alternative? So at a national level, it would probably require some kind of major constitutional amendments to get proportional representation in the US Senate and the US House. So what's the alternative? Well, we can turn our attention to the focus of this forum, which is voting methods. So to make sure we start on the same page here, a voting method defines the form of a ballot used, what constitutes a valid vote on that ballot, how to count votes, and some sort of method or algorithm for determining the outcome of that election. Now, a voting method shouldn't be confused with an election system, concerned with other things like whether you should have early voting, all-mail elections, electronic or paper ballots, etc. Voting method is mathematical. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about some of the most common voting methods, and then we're going to have you try them out and get some experience with them. So you're all familiar with this one. Plurality voting, also known as first-past-the-post voting. You choose one candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. Plurality voting has quite a lot of problems. It has the so-called spoiler effect, which causes people to get mad at good candidates. We end up with accusations such as, "You're wasting your vote helping the enemy." And there's a strong incentive to support the so-called lesser evil in an election. And because of this, campaigns in America are massively geared towards negativity. And good candidates often just don't bother running. And finally, disillusioned voters tend to disengage, resulting in low voter turnout. So just as a sampling, the nationwide turnout in 2018 was only 49.3% of eligible voters, so less than half. And that was the highest in a century for non-presidential elections. Maybe someday we'll get to half. And in Albany County, we were very close to the national figures. We pulled our weight, 48% of voter turnout in Albany County. It's largely because we're a college town and we have lots of students who understand the importance of voting. Maybe half of them, or less. And finally, with plurality voting, you simply learn very little about the preferences of your electorates. Okay, so we're going to turn the lights on, and we're going to have you guys try out plurality voting to decide what kind of tasty dessert snack you're going to have at the end of the talk.
Oh, our blue
It's the blue one.
Blue ballot.
Blue ballot.
Blue. 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 Do we know who made these?
Well, you know, I had a lot of additional questions, and I want some.
Yeah, so one thing that should be on your mind as you're voting here is I want you to imagine you're voting for presidential candidates. Everything is on the line, and you want to do whatever you can to get the best possible outcome for yourself. Think about tactical voting.
But can we campaign?
Campaign.
So, can the cookie bakers campaign?
We're too close to the
No,
polling place.
no, you're not.
That would be electioneering.
You're not voting for people or any particular cookies that you might have in mind or that you might think are available over there, for example. You're voting for a candidate, and you should decide on your candidate because all of your ballots should reflect your preferences in the same way. So decide what your preferences are. We need you to vote the same preferences on each different type of ballot, okay?
Okay.
So you can't switch from lemon bars to brownies in,
We could.
in this, yeah, you
We
could.
wouldn't know.
You
But-
should switch from lemon bars. That's
Well, no, not actually.
Wait on that, buddy.
So you want to think
Electioneering. Yeah, that was
think of each cookie as a candidate. These are your
Each
candidates.
cookie is a
You
candidate.
have to be 100 feet away from the library if you want to tell people what to vote for.
All right. So I get one.
nothing you was accused of.
All
You
right.
only get one here.
We'll pick up the ballots as we go along. So vote your blue ballot. You only get one vote. You make an X in one place. Everybody understands that.
No. I like them all.
They do realize that the chocolate consortium is willing to help with
I think there's some
But not this time. This time it's just
I know,
one.
I'm close to electioneering here. Explain with Mark.
All right.
Did you vote them in? Oh, right on.
You ever both your blue one? Got a blue one from everybody?
Are we done with plurality? Did you vote?
Does everybody feel like they've expressed their social choice? Okay.
If you switch your preferences across the ballots, then we won't be able to compare methods very
Right.
well.
Well, regardless what happens, I think you'll find that we might be electing different winners depending on the voting method.
Oh, that's awesome. That's part of voting.
We need a constitutional, actually we need a new constitution for that.
Correct a few things, yeah. On a brownie lemon coalition.
Okay, do we have all the ballots? All right. So we're all familiar with plurality voting. We know how to game that system. All right, well, let's move on. So let's talk about a different voting method now, an alternative voting method. One of the simplest alternative voting methods. It's called approval voting. So, unlike plurality voting, approval voting lets you choose as many candidates as you like. That's right. And again, the candidate with the highest number of votes is the one who wins. Simple, subtle difference. So approval voting ballots are very familiar. You just change the instructions on the ballots. And in fact, you have far less spoiled ballots because you don't have to throw your ballot out if you mark more than 1, or 2, or 3, or 4. Now, let's go back. You are already a little bit familiar with approval voting, and you may not realize it. Every time you vote for some kind of school district board or certain city councils, I'm not sure if it applies to Laramie, anytime in an election when it says vote for 2, or vote for no more than 2, well, that is a limited form of approval voting. Because you can actually choose to only vote for 1. Now, the thing about approval voting is it can be implemented on voting systems already in widespread use, including electronic voting machines, without any fundamental restructuring. All you change is the instructions. And it's easy to audit. Okay, let's try that out.
It's the kind of tan color. Darker tan.
Oh, approval, there it is.
Brownish.
The Borda Count?
No, it says approval on it. Yeah, the brownish one.
Approval, you can check either yes or no, but not both.
Can I start an trustee?
Ballots?
We know how to make this
Well, I
one.
like them all. Here,
Well, you can vote for
You
all
can,
of
you
them.
can vote for all of them.
We have to vote no?
No, you can have all the others.
Lobbyists.
No.
There you go. There's a lobbyist. I've got to make at least
We don't have to vote against it. I mean,
It's very hard to figure out.
if you're not
I don't know.
voting yes.
You should ask your corporate overlords.
So Matthew, we got a question.
How do-
If you don't vote yes or no on one particular cookie, what does that
Is
do
that
to
a
your
no?
ballot?
Is that a no?
That's all right.
It just doesn't add any points to that candidate.
So it's a no.
But no doesn't mean it. Because it doesn't increase any of the sides. It's just, it's an abstention.
Approval.
Yeah.
You have to
Okay.
opt into approval for an
So
approval.
it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
What constitutes 50% would change?
So the no.
So think of it this way. One of the columns on our ballot, our approval ballot, is actually kind of redundant. We don't really need it. It could be the same as plurality voting. You just select as many yeses as you want. So if you don't want to select any no's, don't bother. If you don't have any marks, we're just going to assume it's a no anyway.
I see Dave's ballot. Don't you want to look at that? It looks like Dave.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, then you're basically
Wouldn't
social
abstaining be
media
different
thumbs
than
up.
marking no though?
Because you're still tallying the number of no votes, and if there's no votes at all, yes or no, positive or negative, then the number is just less.
If you are in, sorry, I'm talking over you. If you are in an actual election system where you're doing a plurality and no one gets any vote and everyone who voted in that election abstained, they would have to run it again, wouldn't they?
Are you saying
Question for
nobody entered the voting booths for an election or something?
That people entered the voting booths, but when it came to the plurality vote, that no one, if everyone abstained from the plurality vote, it wouldn't be assumed that everyone voted no.
So in this example, if we're all severe diabetics and these are all high sugar cookies, none of us are going to necessarily say no because we all like cookies, but we also can't say yes because we can't eat them.
I think Jackie might be able to answer this better. Jackie, is it usually true that if you don't bother voting, it's perfectly fine? It just isn't counted. Okay.
And we have statutory tiebreakers for circumstances that are supposed to assume all circumstances. And I think they've worked so far.
But the candidate would vote for themselves. So
Yeah, you'd assume at least get the candidate and the
Lemon bar
family
would
for
say
each of them, probably, so then it's the biggest family wins.
But Jackie, doesn't that differ for judicial retention? Isn't it? There's one type. Anyway, that's
Okay.
I could be wrong.
Does everybody feel like they've finished their approval ballot?
You're
You have
pointing about.
Our collector is going to get them later, or? Okay. All right. Let's move on. So let's talk a little bit more about approval voting. A little bit about its history. Approval voting was used for parliamentary elections in Greece in the late 19th and early 20th century, where voters would drop a little marble in these canisters here to indicate approval or disapproval. Oxy means no, nae is yes. An interesting thing about approval voting and many other alternative voting methods is that it's actually been reinvented lots of times throughout history, and people just forgot. So approval voting was used for about 500 years in the serene Republic of Venice to elect the city-state's leader, the Doge of Venice. And the only reason they got rid of it was because Napoleon conquered Venice and said, I don't like this method, you're going to plurality voting. And then finally, in the recent history, approval voting was reinvented independently by actual voting methods scientists several times in the 60s and 70s. And it's used today in straw polls to elect the United Nations Secretary General, It's used by a considerable number of professional societies, including the Mathematical Association of America, the American Mathematical Society, the American Statistical Association, and it was recently adopted by Fargo, North Dakota in 2018, leading the charge with approval voting. All right, so we've tried a simple voting method. Now we're going to try a tough one. This one is called instant runoff voting. So rather than a check mark to indicate your support or non-support for a candidate, voters order their choices by preference with instant runoff voting. Instant runoff voting has a lot of names you might have heard before. It's also known as preference voting in Australia. It's called the Hare method after one of the guys that helped develop it, or ranked choice voting. But beware the terminology of instant runoff voting, or IRV, because it's only one type of ranked voting method. You should really not call it ranked choice voting. In fact, there are scores of different ranked voting methods, 50, 60, 70, as many as people can think up. Yeah. So, a little bit more about instant runoff voting. The way that they're counted. Ballots are tallied according to voters' first choice in the ranking. And if a candidate attains a majority of the votes in that first choice, then they're declared the winner, and the counting ends there. If no candidate has a majority of votes, the candidate with the lowest number of first choice votes is removed from people's rankings, and then those votes are transferred to their voters' second choice candidate, effectively simulating an automated runoff election, or instant runoff. And then the process continues until finally one candidate does achieve a majority. So let's try it out.
Whoa. Oh, here it is, the yellow one.
Yellow.
So my favorite gets a 1.
Yes.
Okay, like golf.
You want us to mandatory 1 through 4?
Yes. For this example, please do that. In some municipalities in the world that use a variant of instant runoff voting, they'll make rules like list at least the first 3 or 4 candidates. And then people don't bother doing the other ones, and that's not a spoiled ballot. You've lost voting power, essentially. Yes?
Did you change the order in which they were listed on the ballot? Or would you if you were conducting an official election? In other words,
randomize the ballot?
My ballot says lemon bars first. Does everybody's ballot say that?
Yes.
Well, I think that's maybe a question for Jackie. Because do we do that in plurality voting to avoid influencing? Yeah, so I guess we probably would do that for instant runoff.
And then you'd call it a spoiled ballot if they didn't put all numbers down or something?
So the way to spoil an instant runoff ballot is if you list 2 candidates with the same ranking. It's not allowed. This is a ranking method, not a rating method.
So can you leave a candidate out altogether and just rank one?
Well, let's not do that today. But like I said, in some jurisdictions that use forms of instant runoff voting, they'll say, we only want the first 3 or 4 choices, and then it's up to the voter if they want to put more ranks.
And is it 51% or a supermajority?
It's 50.111111%.
50%. Yeah.
Clear majority. When a clear majority is achieved, we stop the instant runoff mechanism.
So how do we game it?
That's a good question. Why don't you ask me at the end of the talk? I'll just say instant runoff voting can be gamed. There are lots of ways to do it, and in fact, in places that use it regularly, like Ireland, Malta, and Australia, the political parties regularly hand out really elaborate lists of voting recommendations for people so that they get just the right ranking to help out their party the most, which is not always a sincere ranking.
Yeah, it's complicated, but that's what we do.
Yeah, well, like here in a multi-race, like if you had 4 people running for 2 county commissioner slots, we sometimes advise people to, like say, bullet vote, just vote for 1 rather than 2. But in this scenario, if you only vote for one, you sacrifice your subsequent choices
Right.
if your first choice person doesn't make the cut.
Well, you would think so, but instant runoff voting has a peculiar characteristic that a lot of other voting methods don't have. It's called non-monotonicity. And, well, actually, it's called the, sorry, one second. The stay-home paradox. The stay-home paradox. It turns out staying home and not voting at all can sometimes help your favorite candidates in instant runoff votes because of the way that the instant runoff mechanism works. I can show you more about that at the end of the talk.
Next. I want to say something about people who don't vote. If you look at the vote tally, it'll say undervotes and overvotes for the total, and you can see it after the end of the election. And you get a lot of undervoting when they're more obscure races and voters are not confident in the choices they might be making. At least that's my theory about why they're undervoting. Jackie may disagree.
And an undervote means you didn't vote at all for a particular
In a particular race, yeah.
Okay, how are we feeling? Any stragglers?
Move on.
All right. We're going to have fun counting that one. It's also a lot of fun to count. All right, a little bit more about instant runoff voting. Instant runoff voting necessarily requires modifying your ballot. Obviously, you can't rank choices when you just have one box next to each candidate without inventing some kind of numbering system. And the difficulty of counting and determining the winner in instant runoff voting expands geometrically the more candidates are on the ballot. So just as an example, when you have two candidates in a race, there's 2 ways that someone can order those candidates. When you have 3 candidates in the race, there's 6 ways. When there's 4 candidates, there's 24 ways, and so on. And you need to know all of those orders in order to run the algorithm to determine the winner. And in instant runoff voting, determining the winner necessarily involves centralization of vote information because you can't perform an instant runoff until you have all the votes together. And thus, you cannot determine the winner of an election immediately from cumulative precinct reports on election night. And finally, we discussed this a little bit, but instant runoff voting actually invents some counterintuitive voting outcomes and tactical voting incentives that may be undesirable. And it's difficult to audit. Very difficult. So if you suspect election fraud with instant runoff voting, have fun recounting it. So a little bit about the history of instant runoff voting. It emerged in the mid-19th century as a spin-off of a sister voting method called the single transferable vote. The single transferable vote is one of the first proportional representation methods to see widespread use around the world. And somebody thought, well, hey, I'll just take this and retool it for single winner elections. So, as I said earlier, IRV is used in Ireland, Malta, and Australia for single winner elections. And it was recently adopted by the state of Maine in 2016. And just like, I think a week and a half ago, was adopted by New York City for their elections. And it was also, interestingly, has been adopted and then later repealed a number of times in the US, including in Burlington, Vermont in 2010. They got one of these counterintuitive election results that made people so angry that they got rid of instant runoff voting and returned to plurality votes. So let's move on to a different kind of ranking method. This one's called the Borda Count. As I said, it's another ranking method. So your task here is going to be virtually the same. You're going to order your choices by preference. We just changed the ordering this time to make the ballots clearly different for you. So in this instance, you're going to mark 4 for your most preferred candidate and 1 for your least preferred candidate. Just reverse the order. And it's mathematically identical. And the way that it is counted is done a little differently than instant runoff voting. So each candidate has points associated with the rank that you gave them, and these points are simply summed up for each candidate. And then the candidate that wins is the one with the most points. Really simple. So let's try that.
So why wouldn't that just be the same optical ballot like we use now, where you just fill in 4 of the little circles instead of 1? What's the problem with it?
Well, the issue is most voting software is designed to only have 1 checkbox per candidate. So actually, you could probably do instant runoff voting on current software. What you would need to do is have a ton of checkboxes on a single screen for a single race. Like, if you had 4 candidates, you would need 24 checkboxes to indicate all the different orders you might prefer. And the other issue is voting software today only accepts a binary input. You either check the box or you don't check the box. Whereas with a ranked system, if you were to do it differently than the way I just described, you would need some kind of numeral system. You would need a numpad, a virtual numpad on your touchscreen or something to consistently mark a clear number for each candidate so that to avoid spoilage. Yeah.
I run a nonprofit and we give scholarships to students, and this last year I used Borda Count because we had three scholarship candidates and we had only a pool of money, and it turned out that everyone agreed at the top, and then the next 2 was evenly split, but they each got the same score, so I just cut the remaining money in half. And everyone was happy. My board understood it because we feel that this was a really logical way to go about things. I'm excited to see what's wrong.
So you're actually describing a multi-winner election in your use of it. You're saying you want like the top 3 candidates. And so you can do that with Borda Count too.
We wanted the top 2, right? We wanted the person to get the large money and then the smaller pool.
Right.
And since they were even on the smaller pool, I just made the smaller pool smaller.
I've actually gamed a Borda Count at some point, but I won't say where, so.
Yeah, Borda Count can also be gamed. In fact, there's a particular way in which it can be gamed that's really effective. And I don't remember it, so maybe I'll shoot you an email later if you want to hear more. Or maybe Chris knows.
You need to figure out who the likely alternative candidates are and then coordinatedly balance them for a lower score so that nobody elevates them. So you wash out theirs and make sure that yours get the highest count. So
burying people, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, how are we feeling about that? Anybody still figuring out a preference?
No, we're good.
Okay. Okay, a little bit more about Borda Count. Its history and current usage. Borda Count, like many other voting methods, was invented several times in history and forgotten. Borda Count was used by the Roman Senate in the early 2nd century AD. Several different medieval scholars, alchemists, wrote about Borda Count. And then finally, it was reinvented once more by a French mathematician and physicist by the name of Jean-Charles de Borda, where we get the name Borda Count, in 1770. And he used it to elect members of the French Academy of Sciences. And they used it for about 2 or 3 decades. Interestingly, de Borda also devised the meter as the basis for the metric system. We're still catching up there. De Borda's reinvention of Borda Count, and his published writings on it effectively ushered in the new science of election methods. People really hadn't published much rigorous scientific analysis on voting methods before him. But our friend Napoleon came by again, and when he got elected, when he sort of usurped power in the French Academy of Sciences, he removed the Borda Count and returned them to plurality vote. So that was the end of that story for about 100 years. Okay, yeah. So finally we come to the last voting method that we're going to try out tonight. It's called score voting, also known as range voting. Now, this is a so-called rating method rather than a ranking method. So that means that candidates can receive the same rating if you want. Score voting is used to determine winners in a lot of subjective Olympic events like figure skating, swimming, things like that. Score voting is the only voting method that zoologists have found to be used by animals. It's used by bees and some ants to collectively choose their new nesting locations. And fun fact, approval voting, which you tried earlier, is actually a form of score voting. It's the form with only 2 options. So tonight, we're going to try out a version of score voting with 4 possible ratings. Remember to think strategically as you fill out these ballots.
People really need sample ballots. It's very hard to spoil a score ballot. Remember, candidates can receive the same ratings as each other if you want them to.
You can't look at my ballot.
You're hungry, aren't you?
I haven't had my dinner yet.
Yeah, I can tell. Everything gets a 3, I'm hungry.
If you want, you could give 3 candidates 0s and the other a 3. That's something you can do with score voting.
To make sure you're...
And when you do that, and when you make that kind of strategic vote in score voting, where you just give some candidates or one candidate's the max and the rest the minimum, it basically is the same thing as approval voting. It generates into approval voting. Okay, how are we feeling?
All good.
Fingers crossed you're going to get that dessert item you really wanted. We'll see. All right, so we've gone through several different voting methods tonight. This is just a taste of all the different kinds of voting methods there are. I've seen like 80, 90 different voting methods in my research. But the big question is, all right, so we have some alternatives to plurality voting. How do we choose? Well, the first issue is that there is no perfect voting method. This has been proven mathematically in the 50s by a guy by the name, people thought this was proven mathematically by a guy by the name of Kenneth Arrow in the 50s. But in fact, his so-called impossibility theorem only applied to ranked voting methods and not to rating methods like approval or score voting. But there is a different theorem put together in the 70s called the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem, which basically demonstrates that ranking or rating, no matter your voting method, tactical voting is basically inevitable outside of a dictatorship. So is all hope lost? No. Surely some voting methods are still better than other voting methods. So how do we pick the best voting method? Well, if only we could read voters' minds, if only we could probe their deepest subconscious desires, if only everyone was always 100% honest. Sadly, we don't live in that world. So we have the next best thing, we can choose an expressive ballot which incentivizes the least amount of tactical voting. Now, how do we figure that out? So in the past, voting method science has revolved around an axiomatic or criterion-based approach, where your scientists establish a set of desirable behaviors they want in a voting method, a set of criteria they really like, and they ask, will this voting method, for instance, always elect a candidate that would have won all pairwise competitions if it exists? This is the so-called Condorcet winner you may have heard of. Can you get an undesirable outcome for honestly voting for your favorite candidates, as we talked about a bit with instant runoff voting? Does voting favorable for a candidate always help them? Does voting unfavorably for a candidate always hurt them? These two combined are the so-called monotonicity criteria. Those are some examples. So you take these criteria that you really like, and you determine which voting method satisfies those criteria. The problem with this approach is it's very subjective. People have a lot of good arguments for why their criteria is more important than your criteria. So what's a different way we can approach it? Well, in the turn of the millennium, voting science started to take a different approach to evaluating voting methods, a so-called utility approach. So now that we had powerful computers, we could run simulations of voters, candidates, and outcomes using different voting methods. And the way this works is we devise a measure of voter happiness with the outcome of an election, so-called utility. And we evaluate the impact of strategic and honest voting within different voting methods. The thing about this approach is it effectively combines all of the information of subjective criteria together with their relative weightings into a single statistic. A single quantitative statistic that can be compared and contrasted among different voting methods. So it's a bit like we're racing our voting methods together and seeing which one wins the race. So, let's put on our math hats for a second here. Here we go. The way this works is, imagine we have some election issue that matters to people, and it exists on a spectrum. For example, maybe how much should we tax the rich? Should we tax them a lot? Should we tax them a little bit? Should we not tax them? Should we give them a bunch of the government's money? Some issue on a spectrum. And then we have our candidates, who also exist at some point on that spectrum. And our voters, again, are somewhere on that spectrum. And so we look at the election, and we measure the distance on this spectrum between the voter and candidates. And we call this voter utility, or the inverse of it anyway. It's a quantifiable distance from voters' preferred position and a candidate's position. So the further they are away from that candidate, the less utility. Basically, the further they are away, the madder they're going to be if that candidate wins. So we have our election winner here. In this example here, the center candidate would be the so-called socially optimal candidate because it minimizes the distance between our voters. So we're not done yet. So if we take these differences between voters and candidates, and so one of them is the utility associated with the actual election winner, and the other is the utility associated with the socially optimal candidates, the candidate closest to everyone's position on an issue spectrum. When we subtract them from each other, we find out the difference. We end up with a statistic called voter regret, which is basically the average avoidable human unhappiness associated with using a particular election method. So for instance, if your election method always elected the socially optimal candidate, you would say the voter regret is, no, it wouldn't be, yeah, it'd be 0. Yeah. And if your election system always elected someone way far out, you're going to have a very high voter regret on average. Okay, one more step. So we have our issue spectrum, right? We run simulations with a random placement of candidates and voters on this single issue spectrum. And then we compute the average voter regret associated with all these simulations we've done to come up with something called the Bayesian regret. Bayesian basically just means you're working with a distribution of possible regrets. And then finally, we compare our average Bayesian regret using 100% honest voters with the average regret using highly tactical voters with whatever voting method that we're looking at. And so let's see what that all looks like graphically. So here's a study published in the year 2000 by Warren Smith. I think he's an electrical engineer. Oh, by the way, most voting method theorists aren't voting method theorists by profession. It's a very marginalized field, so they pick it up as like a side hobby. Okay, so we see,
if you look at plurality voting here, we see that it has some of the lowest voter satisfaction efficiency, which is basically analogous to, it's synonymous with Bayesian regret. And our y-axis here is the simplicity of our voting method. You see, plurality is pretty simple, so it's near the top. And we also see that approval voting is doing pretty good here. It's kind of remarkable how well it's doing for such a simple voting method. Likewise, score voting is experimentally, not just in this, well, I'll show you the next figure. Experimentally, we see that with 100% honest voters, it has some of the smallest amount of regret associated with an undesirable outcome of an election. On the other hand, our Borda Count and instant runoff voting span a huge range of possible regrets. So the point here for Borda Count is maximally strategic voters, and over here is maximally honest voters. And we see that in maximally strategic voters, instant runoff voting actually approximates the same voter regret as plurality voting. Now, one more interesting thing about this figure is note the distance between a random election winner and plurality voting. The voter satisfaction associated with voting in our current system. That's about how much we achieved when we invented democracy, or electoral politics anyway. Now, note the distance between plurality voting and the best of approval and score voting. We see that we could potentially double our satisfaction with elections by switching to a better voting method. Or double our regret with bad candidates. Or I'm sorry, have the regret with bad candidates. Okay, now, I don't know how readable this figure is. Unfortunately, the person who made it decided they like really tiny fonts. But here's another simulation for a whole bunch of different voting methods, also dealing with the voter satisfaction index, which again is a synonym of Bayesian regret. And what is the y-axis? Unimportant. So here's IRV with maximally strategic voters, IRV with maximally honest voters. So blue is totally honest, and red is the most strategic. So we see that, again, ranking methods like Borda Count, like IRV, and some other ones up here, tend to perform less well than rating methods like score and approval voting. The ones at the very top, the so-called star voting, that just means score then a runoff. So it's a kind of scoring method that guarantees a runoff election. And you see it actually is ever so slightly better than raw score voting.
Is 7 ranked pairs? RP ranked pairs?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it seems like all the math is going to depend on how many candidates you had. If you only had 2 candidates, then all this would just collapse.
Correct.
So are all these based on some standard 6-candidate races or something?
Yeah, so let's go back to this figure. This used 5 candidates, 200 voters, and 2 issues. This is one of like 100 different figures in this really big paper Warren Smith published. I think it's like a 40-page paper. And this is probably one of his most realistic simulations. But yes, the regret depends on the number of candidates. So you should only compare elections with the same number of candidates, the same number of voters, and the same number of issues between different voting methods.
So do these bars all wander around if I have different numbers of candidates, or do they keep their same
the general shape is typically the same. Okay. Sometimes, like instant runoff voting, crawls a little further over here, depending on simulation. But it never beats the best of approval voting or the best of score voting. Okay. Okay, so we've looked at some different voting methods tonight. We've learned a little bit about how to compare them, perhaps which voting methods are maybe better than some others. The bottom line is that election method science still hasn't really reached a consensus on the best voting method. I talked about this utility approach, but it's probably like 60–70% of the field right now that accepts that. Other people are still really ingrained in the axiomatic, criterion-based approach of analyzing methods. But importantly, alternative voting methods can result in more competitive elections. They can drive higher voter turnout by giving the electorate disenchanted with the major parties a reason to vote. And potentially they can reduce the negativity of campaigning and make candidates focus more on themselves instead of the worst aspects of their opponents. There is one thing, however, that election method scientists are in unanimous agreement about. Plurality voting stinks.
Are you
that? I'm open for questions.
Are you sure random is worse?
Are you sure random is worse?
Well, that is an interesting question. So that depends on how you define democracy. So we get this word democracy from the ancient Athenians, but the way we use it today is totally different from how they would use it. If you look at some of the writings of Aristotle and I think Xenophon, the Athenians actually thought that electoral politics was always oligarchy, because they noticed this tendency in electoral politics for the betters of society, the people with the money, the free time, the resources. Those are the ones that can afford to run for office. They're the ones that can afford to be in office. And there's always a tendency in a class of people for that class to look out for its own class interests first. So the Athenians literally called what we have today oligarchy. And it's funny we invented this word in political science, representative democracy. It's not what they thought. So the solution for the Athenians and some other Greek city-states was to use this thing called sortition, where they actually did have random ways of choosing public officials. In fact, they had these very elaborate machines called a cleroterion, where basically anybody who wanted to serve some kind of public position, now granted they're all free adult men, so no women and no slaves, which were about 1/3 of the population in Greek or more at any given time. But free adult men could put themselves in a pool to serve for public office, and then they'd get selected at random. But all the major decisions in the state, in public life, were done by direct referenda. So that's how the Athenians defined democracy. And I don't know. There's some interesting work in computer science recently by a guy by the name of Paul Cockshott that, yes, his name is Rooster Shooter, that suggests ways in which we could actually implement sortition and direct referenda today with the internet, basically. To me, that sounds like a really bad idea, but he has some interesting arguments. Yeah.
If we all vote for chocolate chip cookies, and you are electoral vote, but you like lemon bars under the new rules, you can have a lemon bar. How do you control voting then?
Yeah, no, that's right.
We have electoral for president.
I'm sorry, say it again. It's really hard for me to think about tactical voting up here.
Okay, if the electoral college, right?
Yeah.
50?
Right.
Some of them no longer have to vote the way their state votes. They don't have to vote the way the state votes.
Right. So you're talking about presidential elections.
If we all voted for chocolate chip cookies, and you were our electoral vote, but you wanted lemon bars, you vote for lemon bars. What do our votes count for?
Well, they don't count. And in fact, this thing we call the Electoral College was originally developed to give the landholding elites in early America a way to override the public opinion. And in fact, if you look at Madison's notes to the Philadelphia Convention, you will find that most of them were very suspicious of this idea that the common person is smart enough to make decisions about society.
So the Electoral College is a separate issue, which we should have a meeting about as well.
Yes.
Well, I
So-
want to know who won.
So for the second time in 16 years, the Electoral College delivered the candidates that was not what the people wanted. Maybe it's time to have a conversation about that. But remember, the president is just one office. Yeah.
I'm just intrigued by this idea of trying to determine voter regret, because if the regret is the difference between what the voter's position on an issue was and the candidate's position on an issue.
And the optimal. What if the voting method selected the optimal candidate? It's the difference between those two forms of utility, the real utility they got from the election and the optimal utility if the election had picked the best candidate for them.
Right. Okay, so, but, you know, I mean, I know people vote for candidates that they don't agree with, either out of ignorance or
Party loyalty.
party loyalty or whatever, so how do you determine their satisfaction in that kind of a case?
It's perceived. They're voting for.
They're just what,
Yeah, it's based
they're
on
happy
perceived
even though
candidate.
they voted for somebody who doesn't agree with them.
Or candidates tell you things.
So actually, what we're talking about, so what the statistic is referring to is not necessarily what the voter voted for, but the candidates that the voting method gave them.
That gave them, okay, all right.
Can we see results?
Yes, have we finished counting?
Yes.
So I think Robin's gonna
The
give you.
tallying team is going to introduce the results. We're going to take turns.
Lemon bar, we have 13.
Lemon bar.
Chocolate chip, 8.
Brownies,
3.
Oh.
3.
Lemon bar.
Lemon bar is the winner.
And this is the easy.
Yes, if you don't like it, you say no, or you can leave it blank. Who do you guys think is the winner for this one?
Still lemon bars.
11 with that kind of.
Why?
Always gonna win.
So we have lemon bar, we have 22. Macaron, we have 12.
Oh yeah.
Brownie, we have 15. And chocolate chips, we have 19.
It's close.
Close race.
So we see how we've obtained more information about public opinion with just this simple change in instructions on a ballot.
Okay, now we're going to do instant runoff, which I think is the third one you mentioned, right? So we're doing these in order. Now, this is the extremely complicated one because it has to, what we do is we track each preference profile, and that means that each voter's choices in order. So, given your first choices, if there is a clear winner among first choices, remember you marked your first, second, third, and fourth choices here. If there's a clear winner among your first choices, clear winning meaning a majority, not just a plurality, but a majority, then that candidate wins. But if there's not a clear winner, if there's not a majority, then the lowest candidate is dropped and all the second place votes are cast.
Or rather, the preference profiles are distributed among the remaining candidates.
Right, right. The preference profiles for the lowest place candidate, which was dropped. So in other words, all those second choices rise to the top.
Right.
This keeps going until somebody wins a majority. That is to say, more than 50%. So we had some interesting results here. Okay, so somebody's gonna need to write that down on the. Here, you take that. I'll take this. So our first result was this. So we added up all of the first choices. This is the lemon bar. This is the lemon bar sheet right there. You might not be able to see that too well. This is the chocolate chip sheet. So based on first choices only, this is what we had. The macaroon was 4 and the brownie was 3. So those are people's first choices. Okay, so nobody got 50% of 27. There's 27 votes cast here. Nobody got 50% of 27, so we're going to drop this one. Brownies go away, and all of the second choice votes for brownies get cast. That is to say, they get merged into these. And the result of that was simply all of the second choice turned out to be for chocolate chips, so this one increased to 11. But notice there's still no majority. There's still no majority. So what's the lowest one left? The lowest one is the macaroons. And now all of these, all of those second choices get cast. And what happened was that the net effect of that was to increase lemon bars by 4. And so a lemon bar finally ended up with 16 and a majority. Wow. So
go lemon bar.
Go lemon bar.
So lemon bar one in this case,
chocolate chip
as
was
you
in it.
can see here from the chart.
You know, I think brownies would do better if people would make them from a recipe and not a mix.
Think about that when you're eating them.
And not have the crusty things on the end.
Lemon bars.
I thought the brownie supporters would come out for chocolate chip, honestly. I was surprised.
I am curious.
I thought the chocolate party probably would have
So the next
consolidated.
one is a border count. The border count, if you recall, you voted, it was 4 for highest and 1 for lowest. And when that was done, we had tell the difference between people who have experience in a one sort.
What are they writing? When everybody says it's perfect, what's the best? I should not have. Well, I guess you can.
Okay, so lemon bars, 78.
Not a majority.
Wow.
If nobody got a majority, then
And chocolate chip, 73.
Whoa.
It's okay, there's comeback, don't worry, maybe.
65 for brownies.
Oh.
Really surprises me. And 54 for macaroons.
You think it was rigged?
And so all we did is we just added up the numbers you gave each.
So lemon bars won everything.
Now, I heard someone say people were changing their votes on this. Now, we can't necessarily tell that because the way instant runoffs work, the results, the second place, the person in the final runoff that didn't win might have been different than chocolate chip cookie, even if you voted sincerely on it. You know what? I'll explain how that works.
No, we're still doing the results.
After we finish the results.
Yes.
Okay, but Borda, we're done on one pass, right? That was the winner.
Yes.
So we've had 4 lemon bar victories. What do you think is going to happen?
I think lemon bars all the way.
All right. Think again.
Brownies are going to be off us.
So first, for macaroons, we had 37.
And remember, this was the score that you assigned from 0 to 3.
Yeah, so this gives sort of a preference profile, I guess you could say.
And 0 meant?
We assume
No
0
score.
means you don't
Yeah.
like them.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah.
And then brownies had 50 votes. 50 votes.
Wow.
Chocolate chips had 58. And lemon bars had 56.
The election was stolen.
I like the score voting.
Well, we have good news. I lied. We actually have all of those treats in the back. You're free to help yourselves to them for a little bit.
before we reconvene to hear what Jackie and Chris have.
Yeah, so grab a sample, one or all. And I know that I heard some comment about brownies being from a box or I can certify that one set of those brownies are homemade. They do have nuts in them too, just as a warning.
Now, the other brownies are from a mix at Fredley's.
Gonzalez, who's our Albany County Clerk.
Yay!
Yay! And how many terms now?
This is my 8th term.
Good for you.
And my last. I will tell you, my last term.
We didn't hear that. and Chris Rothfuss, who is the Wyoming State Senator from District 9, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And they are going to address here, I'm not exactly quite sure what they have in mind. We kind of invited them and gave them free range, only with the loose idea of making this a little more applied to talk about legislative issues that are involved with various voting methods and the local issues from that standpoint. So I welcome them to come up, and I think Jackie, you drew the short straw, is that right? You're going to go first, and then Chris, and then we're going to have Matthews. We'll have Matthew come up and join him at the table and just do some quick Q&A at that point. And so that I don't have to come up here again, really, there are things on the back table that you're free to take, particularly the posters, send them out. One is slightly on lighter stock paper that was designed for mailing, though it's kind of hard to tell the difference of which is heavier or lighter. So feel free to take those and distribute them around. And I also wanted to thank our 2 UW honor students that are here at the back, who Robin Hill recruited to come and help us tonight. And Bethany and Dakota.
Thank you.
All right.
First of all, thank you. I always love the opportunity to partner with the league, and it seems like we're getting more and more involved in doing some joint efforts in trying to get the vote out, for one thing, trying to get voters or young adults and even older adults registered. We have a voter registration drive coming up on Tuesday. And so we are working in preparation for the 2020 election cycle. Going into this legislative session, you know, there is some proposed legislation that has to do with elections. We always seem to work on some cleanup language, and I know Chris will allude to some of his proposed legislation that he'd like to speak about. In listening to Matthew's talk, what an awesome job that he did and a lot of research. He has always asked me a question or two anytime we've had the ability to be in a same setting, and I just marvel at his interest and the time that he's taken. He obviously has a passion, and it'll be interesting to see where, if any of these options are available, will they become legislation that we have an option how to vote in the state of Wyoming. One of the things that the Wyoming Clerks Association is working with the Secretary of State's office is new election equipment. And of course, right now, we don't know if we will have funding available. I know that the Secretary of State's office has worked with a committee to receive bids. They're going through the bids. We don't know if they're going to be one vendor that's going to be used in the state of Wyoming or multiple vendors. Certainly it's a big concern for us because education is such a big key. Not only for us to educate our electors, but for us to be educated so that we can run smooth elections in Albany County. We have been very, very successful in the past. I have an awesome election team. I have one of my election staff here, Stacy Harvey. We always work hard and work together as a team because we have to take that team approach. It's important. And we rely on all of you as well as the other public in helping us make the best decision for Albany County. So whatever we do in changes of legislation, know that we're open. We're always looking for ways, if there are ways to improve. We're very transparent. I love the open door policy. I'm always willing to listen to ideas, suggestions, and mostly criticism. If there are areas for improvement in any of the responsibilities that I have as the county clerk, but mostly in elections, please bring it to our attention. We want to continue that collaboration of working together and having the best election outcome of the 23 counties in the state of Wyoming. Yes.
Well, I'm happy to be here also. This is something that I'm very passionate about. I've had conversations with Matthew before about alternative election strategies, and this presentation was exceptional. So I think we should give him very informative, and it was particularly educational having the opportunity to do the ballots, right? Having a sample election is an incredible way to understand what the alternatives are. And I'm very glad that it came up with a different outcome on at least one of them. And that's the standard.
We underestimated the popularity of lemon bars.
Who knew, right? This is something I've run legislation related to for a number of years. I think I've been running legislation to change our election process in the state of Wyoming for about the last 8 years, or maybe even 9 years. I'm trying to remember if it was my first or second term, or first or second session that I first ran some election reform legislation where I've focused on two things. And one of those is changing the primary process to an open primary so that everybody has access to every ballot that they are interested in voting in. So, and that's obviously something that we know well. It's an issue that we care a lot about in the state of Wyoming. We fight a lot about. There's consternation in every legislative session. There are bills that want to shut down and close down and lock down that primary, and then I'm running legislation along with others to try and open it up, and neither of them pass. So we are where we are. Over the last few years, though, I've added a couple of other concepts. One is, if you have an open primary, how do you get an open primary that accomplishes the objective that Matthew laid out, the objectives, where you do get to vote in every election, the openness is going to give that to you, but how do you make sure that out of the primary come candidates that are the appropriate candidates? First past the post, as has been demonstrated, is